We will begin in Hosea 11, and then as we go, mention a few things in Hosea 11, then 12, 13, 14. It seems like a lot, but they're kind of short chapters somewhat. So in Hosea 11, you'll see a lot of raw emotion from the Lord, and I think it's really one of the best places to see that in the entirety of the Old Testament is this raw emotion being used by God, and so much so that we would think that if someone would tell us that this is written by God, unless us reading it ourselves, we might be prone to disbelieve it, because it's unlike some of the other things in the Old Testament. You're kind of like, well, what's going on here? But there's so much of this behind what God is writing here through his prophet Hosea. It says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim, another name for Israel at times, to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love. And I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent down to them and fed them. He describes them as this calf, and they're through the whole birthing process. They're just learning to walk, they're just brand new, and God is graciously there with them. They shall not return to the land of Egypt. That's probably good news for them. But Assyria shall be their king. We should not we don't want Assyria as their king, because they have refused to return to me. Part of that judgment. The sword shall rage against their cities, consume the bars of their gates, and devour them because of their own counsels. My people are bent on turning away from me, and though they call out to the Most High, he shall not raise them up at all. But here is something that is really filled with such raw emotion. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you up, O Israel? Well, he has every right to, doesn't he? I mean, he just talks about the more I called my children, the more they rejected me. I have provided them with all of these blessings, and yet they keep sacrificing to idols. And he has every right to give them up. He has every right to hand them over. But yet, there's this struggle. How can I do it? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? How can he leave them to be desolate? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my burning anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God and not a man. Praise God for that. The only one, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. They shall go after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, it sounds to be an oxymoron, but when he roars, his children shall come trembling from the west. He's going to roar with might, and his children are going to come that way. They shall come trembling like birds from Egypt, and like doves from the land of Assyria. Him using that language of Egypt, Egypt's always seen as this bondage toward Israel. And that's what he describes as delivering them from. And I will return them to their homes, declares the Lord. Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. But Judah still walks with God and is faithful to the Holy One. At least for now, Judah is being faithful. The last 4 chapters of Hosea are filled with such raw emotions. God is expressing to Israel his steadfast love toward them, even though they don't deserve it at all. If anything, they deserve his wrath and his anger and his judgment, but he's describing to them, thank goodness for you that I'm not like man. Thank goodness that I don't change at the drop of a hat. Thank goodness that I'm not capricious, that I don't like you one moment and I change my mind, but he says that I am the Holy One. But he does mention that he is going to discipline them, that this is going to come about, but even the discipline toward them, in a sense, while it's recompense, they also kind of don't deserve it, because he describes it as something that's loving. It's not just him being upset with them, but he describes it as discipline so that they learn better, as a loving discipline to them. As Israel is his child, and he is their father, most of the wickedness that Israel finds themselves entangled with is the sin of idolatry. You get a little bit of some social issues that's going on, some injustice, some corruption, but most of their idolatry is dedicated, or most of their sin is dedicated to idolatry, and most of it's dedicated to the name Baal. Now, worship to Baal is nothing new for Israel. You're probably most familiar with that worship when the prophetic ministry of Elijah rises up, right? We might be familiar with that when Elijah challenges Ahab and Jezebel, as Ahab is the king of Israel at that time, and he really doesn't like Elijah. He thinks that he's really his pain in his side, his thorn in his flesh. And then you have Jezebel, his wife, who really kind of incorporates Baal worship throughout Israel. And it's really quite tempting for them because the rest of the world worships all different kinds of gods. There's not too many religious practices at that time that would only worship one God. Very few would. And Israel is one of the very few. They see it as, this is the practice. You have been told to worship one God, and that is who you are to worship. And they are tempted by all of these other gods, all of these other faiths out there, and the incorporation of that comes from Ahab and Jezebel. Jezebel is not still a very popular name today, maybe because of Jezebel here. And they're staunch adherents of Baal, and they incorporate this worship in here, and the people follow them. And Baal worship is the reason why you have those 3.5 years of drought. That's what Elijah said. He says, because Israel is limping between two opinions, because Israel is not being faithful to the Lord, then it's not going to rain for 3.5 years. Today, that would be devastating for us. I mean, now you have irrigation systems and things like that, so it's okay, but still, it's not optimal. Even in their time, 3.5 years, that's a long time to go without rain. And that affects everybody. That affects your cattle, that affects food, that affects you, that affects your children, the community, everything. That's what Elijah had said and prophesied. Then Elijah takes this challenge between 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. And just him. And he says, I am the prophet of the Lord, and we're going to have a contest on Mount Carmel. Sounds like a delicious mountain. You go up that mountain, you're going to have this battle, this contest, and he says we're going to cut up a bull, and then you're going to offer it on this, and then whoever God listens to them, then that's who is going to be worshipped by Israel. Well, they're worshiping their God. They're doing everything that they can possibly do. And it's actually one of the saddest verses in the Old Testament, I think. Because there they are, they're cutting themselves with lancets, and they're bleeding, and they're crying out, they're doing everything they can to get their God to pay attention. And the author says there in 1 Kings that though they were wailing, though they were crying, no one heard them. That is one of the saddest verses in the entire Old Testament to me. That, they were doing all of this, they were praying to the wrong God. There was no one there, no one heard on the other end. Elijah prayed once, and he even had the people bring water and pour over the offering just to really up the ante a little bit. With one prayer, the Lord consumed the entire offering. And so, the people aren't going to now worship Baal anymore. And so they murder all the prophets, 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. But even still after that, Baal worship still continues a little bit. It still gets by, and then it still kind of grows up a little bit. It shows how prone the heart is to idolatry. John Calvin said that the heart is like an idol factory. Constantly it's fashioning idols for itself and constantly wanting to worship other things. And that's what happens as our heart deviates from the Lord's purposes. But Baal worship was very common, especially among Canaanites and the Middle East during that time. And so one of the things that's interesting about 1 Kings is Baal was known for two things. He was a god who was a hybrid between a bull and a man. So it's interesting that Elijah chooses to offer a bull, and they agree to it and cut up a bull. And he was known as the god of fertility, so crops and everything. And then he was also known as the god of rain. Well, Elijah kind of took all of those things down. The Lord did, Yahweh. He took all those things down because he said, I'm going to show you it's not going to rain for about 4 years. The offering that you're going to choose is going to be a bull, and you're definitely not going to have fertility in the area as far as crops and everything is going, for sure. God was showing that he was the God of life, and he was taking that away from them. But yet, still, we get Baal worship here in Hosea. People are still so prone to go after it, even though I'm sure that they knew that Elijah won that contest. I'm sure that they knew, but still in the back of their mind, they were like, well, maybe God won't show up for us. Maybe this isn't the right way, so maybe we'll just incorporate as many gods as we can. The more the better, right? So we just incorporate Baal and Asherah and all of these other gods and Chemosh, and then maybe, possibly, one of those gods will hear us. Well, I can't fail then. That showed that they were not committed. That's why God tells them in Hosea 7:8 that they're like a cake that's not turned. On one side, they're burning, and on the other side, they're still doughy. So they're not fully committed. They're only half wet. That's like what Elijah said, that you go limping between two opinions. You kind of want to be in Baal worship, and then also you want to be in worship toward the Lord. We can fall in that same type of spirit as well, wanting to be attached to our idols, attached to our own ways, but then say that this is, well, maybe the wisdom of God is okay for a certain part, but I'm really just going to trust in my own wisdom for a while and go after that and try to mix it, synchronize it. It never goes well for us, does it? Just as if it didn't go well for the Israelites, never did it go well for them. And it never goes well for us whenever we try to incorporate that as well, especially when judgment comes. A part of Hosea's prophetic calling, one thing that he was different in, we mentioned this before at the beginning, is that he was a living demonstration of God's love toward unfaithful Israel. That while Israel was very unfaithful, God showed them through the prophet Hosea and marrying a wife of harlotry and then redeeming her, showing them that this is what I'm going to be like for you. This is how I am going to love you, Israel, even though you've been so unfaithful to me. Hosea had quite a demonstration. Some of the other prophets have demonstrations. Isaiah walks around naked for 3 years, and Jeremiah breaks pots, and Ezekiel cooks food over human dung. So, like I mentioned last time, you don't ever want to get anything from a baker named Ezekiel. At least I imagine he wouldn't be very good in the baking department, but wouldn't be very good, wouldn't be very delicious, I suppose. But that rebellion that was there, the prophets were living out these living demonstrations of Israel's rebellion, of the people's rebellion. Hosea was no different. Chapter 11 teaches us that our love for God should be fueled by his own love toward us. I think of the apostle John here, the disciple John. John refers to himself as the one whom Jesus loved. It makes you wonder, why didn't he ever refer to himself as the one who loved Jesus? Even though he did. And he mentions in 1 John that, well, obviously that is a fruit of being a Christian, is loving Jesus. But he wasn't so infatuated with his love toward Christ. He was mainly infatuated with Christ's love toward him. Even though he had been unfaithful, even though he had ran away, he was one of those disciples too that Jesus said, you had fulfilled the prophecy, smite the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. Well, he was definitely one of those sheep that scattered too. He wasn't there with Jesus and, we'll fight him, Jesus, I'll go to the cross with you. He forsook him, and still, Jesus was still very good to him. Jesus is still very good to us, even in our unfaithfulness, even when we trip up at the time, Jesus is still good to us. While at the time, Israel did not concern themselves properly loving God. They know through this that judgment is coming. Judgment is coming for them eventually. We're going to look at chapter 12 now, which speaks a little bit more about that judgment that's coming upon. Ephraim feeds on the wind and pursues the east wind all day long. They multiply falsehood and violence. They make a covenant with Assyria. We're going to spend a decent amount of time talking about that here. And oil is carried to Egypt. The Lord has an indictment against Judah, so this is a law, courtroom type of language, and will punish Jacob according to his ways. He will repay him according to his deeds. And the womb he took his brother by the heel. So now he's describing Jacob's history, the person Jacob, and changed to Israel, people named after Israel. But it makes you wonder, scholars debate this, is Jacob being brought up here as a positive connotation or as a negative connotation. It could be both. It could be, well, don't be like Jacob in these respects, but then you can be like Jacob in these respects because he wasn't all bad. He wasn't all good either, but he wasn't all bad. In the womb, he took his brother by the heel, Esau, and in his manhood, he strove with God. He strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He met God at Bethel, and there God spoke with us. So they incorporate it now into us. The Lord, the God of hosts, the Lord is his memorial name. So you, by the help of your God, return. Hold fast to love and justice, and wait continually for your God. A merchant whose hands are false balances. So this is some of that social issue that he's talking about. And he loves to oppress. Ephraim has said, but I am rich. That sound familiar to, kind of sounds familiar to Revelation, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. The Laodiceans said that exact same thing. But I'm not poor, I'm rich. But I am rich. I have found wealth for myself. And all my labors, they cannot find in me iniquity or sin. That's a bold statement to say. Mm-hmm. I am the Lord your God. From the land of Egypt, I will again make you dwell in tents, as in the days of the appointed feast. I spoke to the prophets. It was I who multiplied visions, and through the prophets gave parables. If there is iniquity in Gilead, they shall surely come to nothing. In Gilgal they sacrifice bulls. Their altars also are like stone heaps on the furrows of the field. Jacob fled, so he's describing Jacob again, fled to the land of Aram. There Israel served for a wife, and for a wife he guarded sheep. By a prophet the Lord brought Israel up from Egypt, and by a prophet he was guarded. Ephraim has given better provocation, so his Lord will leave his blood guilt on him, and will repay him for his disgraceful deeds. Incorporates a lot there of the person Jacob, and I think that incorporates it to both a positive and a negative, because it describes don't be like Jacob in his prideful arrogance and his rebellion, but be like the Jacob who humbles himself. Be like the Jacob who, after a while, after his brother is after him, he has to be forced to humble himself. Be the Jacob that wrestles with the Lord, and he says, and prevails. Be that type of Jacob. He describes as this broken man that meets the Lord, and he forever has to limp with that limp because the Lord touched his hip socket. He says, be that type of Jacob. And I think he's encouraging the people to be like that. Israel continues to rebel by making a pact with Egypt. That's part of that pact that he mentions from Assyria. So at this time, the northern kingdom, Israel, they, as a king comes under a certain rule, they have a choice whether to keep pleasing Assyria by paying tribute. So they can keep paying tribute, be in good relations with Assyria. Problem is, what if Assyria gets so powerful that they eventually take us over? What if they don't like us anymore? And some of them are wondering, well, is this what God really wants us to do, to make a pact with Assyria, to keep them pleased? Some of the kings got in trouble with this because they wanted to make the other nations like them so much that they feel as though as long as they make a pact with all the other nations, that they don't really need God's power anymore. They don't really need to trust in him because, well, I have all these other nations. I have a powerhouse. Why do we need to obey the Lord? A king that comes in handy to mention here, 2 Kings chapter 17, he wants to change things up a little bit. He's not quite pleased with paying tribute to Assyria, and so he's going to go to Israel's old friend, Egypt. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hosea, okay, so now we're in Hosea, talking about Hosea, the son of Eli, began to reign in Samaria over Israel, and he reigned 9 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. So he was a bad guy, but not as bad as some of the others. You have to love that comparison there. Whenever it mentions good kings, it compares them to usually to David, and he's like King David. He walks after them, and it's like, wow, he was bad, but he wasn't as bad as some of these others. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hosea became his vassal and paid him tribute. So he's been doing that. He's been paying Assyria tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hosea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Hosea, and on the harbor, the river of Gozan, and the cities of the Medes. So right now in the morning, we're going through Ezra. So we're talking a little bit about, or mainly spending our time in the southern kingdom, previously southern kingdom for Jerusalem, but also in the northern kingdom. This is kind of what led up to part of that. They wanted to pay tribute to Egypt, and if they figure Egypt's a really good powerhouse, and they figure if they can have Egypt in their pocket, and if Egypt helps us defeat Assyria, well then we don't have to pay Assyria tribute anymore. So let's just do what we can and get rid of these Assyrians. As you see, it didn't go quite as well for him. He's bound, he's in prison, and that eventually leads to the destruction of the northern kingdom. I may wonder, well, okay, so wasn't that just military strategy? Well, for them, it was much more than just them, trying to figure out another way to do it. They were trying to figure out a way to do it without using God. They didn't want to do things the Lord's way. And they felt as though, it's like the arm of the flesh. If they could do it by their own power, their own might, they feel like they have some control over it. It's like the people, as Moses is up Mount Sinai, and the people are below, and they're like, Aaron, we want a God to worship. So he's like, okay, well, give me your gold rings that the Egyptians gave you, and the gold, and we'll make this calf. He has a carving tool. I guess he's somewhat good at carving, and he carves this calf. And I think they kind of feel as though they feel satisfied. They try to make it go around. They say, oh, this is the God who brought us out of Egypt. Oh, no, this is Yahweh. This is the God who brought us out of Egypt. But I think they felt as though they had control over him. Because, we fashioned you. You're made from our gold earrings. We can see you. Everything makes sense to us from that. And obviously that was one of the reasons why God was not pleased with their idolatry. I think that was part of here what's going on, because they wanted to do things their own way, their own wisdom. And it was forbidden by the Lord to do that, according to, they weren't to go back to Egypt and to make this pact. But, I figured, Egypt's got to be stronger than Assyria, especially us and Egypt. And if we could get Judah on board, oh man, we're just going to be unstoppable. But, obviously it didn't work as well for them there. Last 2 chapters, we'll close. When Ephraim spoke, there was trembling. He was exalted in Israel. He's talking about his past. Israel is this beautiful nation, so powerful, so mighty. But he incurred guilt through Baal and died. And now they send more and more and make for themselves metal images, idols, skillfully made of the silver, all of them the work of craftsmen. It is said of them, those who offer human sacrifice kiss calves. Therefore they shall be like the morning mist, or like the dew that goes early away, like the chaff that swirls from the threshing floor, or like smoke from a window. But I am the Lord your God, from the land of Egypt, and you know no God but me, and besides me there is no Savior. It was I who knew you in the wilderness, in the land of drought. But then they grazed, they became full, they were filled, and their heart was lifted up. Therefore, they forgot me. That's what he mentioned in Deuteronomy. He specifically mentioned, don't forget me when you enter the promised land. So I am to them like a lion, like a leopard, I will lurk beside the way. I will fall upon them like a bear robbed over cubs. I will tear open the breast, and there I will devour them like a lion, as a wild beast would rip them open. He destroys you, O Israel, for you are against your helper. Where now is your king to save you in all your cities? Where are all your rulers, those of whom you said, give me a king and princes? I told them long ago that your kings aren't going to help you necessarily. Remember, they were all like, oh, our king's going to go to battle for us, and he's going to win all the wars and all this stuff. And no, not really. He's going to take all your family. He's going to make them slaves. I gave you a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath. The iniquity of Ephraim is found out. His sin is kept in store. Pains of childbirth come for him, but he is an unwise son. For at the right time he does not present himself at the opening of the womb. Shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? O death, where are your plagues? You might be familiar with this, or in the New Testament, with this shadows. O Sheol, where is your sting? Compassion is hidden from my eyes. Though he may flourish among his brothers, the east wind, the wind of the Lord shall come, rising from the wilderness, and his fountain shall dry up. His spring shall be parched. It shall strip his treasury of every precious thing. Samaria shall bear her guilt, because she has rebelled against her God. They shall fall by the sword. Their little ones shall be dashed in pieces, and the pregnant women open up. Judgment is going to be very harsh for them, and it was. The Assyrians were harsh with the Israelites. But chapter 14, I think, ends on a good note. Return, O Israel, to the Lord your God, for you have stumbled because of your iniquity. Still tells them to return. Take with you words and return to the Lord. Say to him, take away all iniquity. Accept what is good, and we will pay with bulls the vows of our lips. Assyria shall not save us. We will not ride on horses, and we will say no more, our God, to the work of our hands. In you the orphan finds mercy. I will heal their apostasy. I will love them freely, for my anger has turned from them. I will be like the dew to Israel. He shall blossom like the lily. He shall take root like the trees of Lebanon. His shoots shall spread out. His beauty shall be like olive, and his fragrance like Lebanon. They shall return and dwell beneath my shadow. They shall flourish like grain. They shall blossom like the vine. Their fame shall be like the wine of Lebanon. O Ephraim, what have I to do with idols? It is I who answer and look after you. I am like an evergreen cypress. From me comes your fruit. Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the upright walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them. I think Hosea ends on a good note. He tells them that this is going to be very harsh judgment for you. But ultimately, you will be brought back. I think through Ezra we see that. They're going to be brought back, and God promises them that if they call out to him, that he will hear them and he will answer them. He promises the same to us. While we can trust in all of these other externalities and all of these things that to the world tells us to trust, and ultimately the only one that we can trust is Christ, his kingdom. It's the only thing that's sure. It's the only sure foundation. As much as we think that we have this life figured out, this world figured out, I think the pandemic showed us some of that. That, boy, you can't, it's hard to make plans. It's just hard. Your life is a vapor. It's a mist. Here today, gone tomorrow.